My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 42 years old. I've always lived a life measured by discipline and quiet ambition. I grew up in a small town, worked my way up in the corporate world, and built a reputation for reliability, discretion, and precision. I wasn't the type to seek attention or applause. My victories were meant to be private, earned quietly. Yet the life I painstakingly constructed began to unravel one autumn morning, not because of a mistake I made, but because someone I trusted implicitly decided my absence could become their advantage. I had just closed a deal that would secure the next 5 years of my career. It wasn't flashy, but it was important, the kind of deal that required patience, subtle influence, and a deep understanding of people's unspoken motivations. I trusted Michael, my partner and closest friend, to handle a crucial part of the project while I was tied up with clients across the country. Michael had always been the charming one, the bridge builder, the person who could smooth tensions I never could. That's why I didn't think twice when he told me, "I've got it under control, Danny. Don't worry." I returned from the trip, expecting a brief debrief, some congratulations, maybe a beer at the end of a long week. What I found instead was silence in the office, tension in the air, and a sudden shift in the dynamics I thought were unshakable. A chain of emails, carefully hidden from me, had rerouted the deal's credit entirely to him. Every client I had nurtured, every promise I had quietly fulfilled, suddenly carried his name instead of mine. It wasn't shouted, it was whispered, polished, and absolute. When I confronted him, I expected excuses, maybe guilt, maybe the faintest hint of remorse. He smiled, not nervously, not regretfully, but with the calm, unsettling confidence of someone who had already calculated the fallout. "You always work too hard, Daniel," he said. "Sometimes it's better to let things go." He didn't even bother pretending. The betrayal wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, but it cut deeper than anything I had imagined. My blood didn't boil, it steadied. My mind didn't scatter, it sharpened. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the city lights, and tracing the contours of a life that felt suddenly fragile, yet full of opportunity. Betrayal, I realized, isn't just about the act, it's about the vacuum it creates. A vacuum you can either allow to swallow you or use to gather strength. I felt an unfamiliar calm seep in, a quiet understanding that anger was too obvious, too shallow. If I reacted with fury, I would lose more than him. I would lose myself. So I let the world think I was shaken, hurt, maybe even uncertain. I smiled in meetings, nodded at his presentations, and kept the same professional exterior I had always maintained. Inside, I began to map the contours of every move he had made, every secret he thought I didn't know. The seeds of silent strategy had taken root that very night. I wasn't planning revenge through confrontation or chaos. I was planning it through patience, calculation, and timing. And deep down, I already knew the moment of reckoning wouldn't come with noise. It would come with quiet, undeniable precision. The days after Michael's betrayal felt like walking through a fog that smelled faintly of smoke and iron. I replayed every interaction we had shared over the past 5 years, searching for signs I had missed, warnings I had ignored. Every friendly word, every casual laugh, every offhand comment suddenly seemed to carry a hidden edge. It was humbling, uncomfortable, and yet strangely clarifying. Loyalty, I realized, isn't something that can be assumed. It's a fragile currency, easily spent by those who see opportunity in your trust. I began to question the nature of our friendship, but not in a way that was loud or accusatory. Quietly, I catalogued the moments when he had subtly tested my boundaries, times when my trust had been used as a stepping stone. I realized how easily his charm had masked ambition, how effortlessly he had built a web of alliances that left me blind. Betrayal, I learned, is rarely dramatic. It is quiet, patient, and ruthless. And it often comes from those you hold closest. There were nights when I stared at the ceiling, feeling the ache of both loss and clarity. This wasn't just about a professional setback. It was about a fracture in the very understanding of who I believed people to be. I mourned what I had thought was unshakable loyalty, but I did not let the mourning turn into despair. Instead, it became a lens, a way to see the true measure of character and strength. I learned that the sting of betrayal is sharpest when you feel blindsided, but its lesson is sharper still if you choose to pay attention. Every morning, I reminded myself that my response mattered more than the betrayal itself. Fury would have been too obvious, too predictable. Public confrontation would have been satisfying in the moment, but hollow in the long view. I needed to act, but with the precision of someone who understood that silence can speak louder than anger, and patience can crush arrogance more effectively than confrontation. The world was still mine to navigate. I just had to chart a new course. In quiet moments at the office, I observed Michael closely, noting the way he carried himself, the subtle arrogance that had grown over weeks. He believed his victory was complete, that the balance of power had shifted irreversibly, and in his confidence, he revealed every weakness, every blind spot. Betrayal, when handled with silence, allows you to see the betrayer's entire strategy, sometimes even better than they see it themselves. I began to understand that knowledge was the most potent leverage of all. By the end of that week, a calm determination settled over me. I no longer felt the raw sting of shock or disbelief. Instead, I felt the steady rhythm of control returning to my life. The betrayal had not broken me. It had given me clarity, and clarity, I realized, is the first step in reclaiming power. I would not react in haste or with noise. I would wait. I would plan. And when the time was right, the quiet strength I nurtured in these days would speak far louder than any words ever could. I spent the next few weeks moving through my days like a ghost, polite and unassuming on the surface, but with every thought carefully measured. I began retracing every deal, every conversation, every document that had passed through Michael's hands. Patterns emerged where I had previously seen coincidence, favors he had called in, approvals he had pushed through, subtle promises he had made to clients. Each one became a thread I could tug at when the time was right. The power of observation, of quiet patience, became my constant companion. I realized that the leverage I sought wasn't confrontation, but proof, not evidence of malice, but clarity that could dismantle the illusion of his invincibility. In silence, I gathered every email, every signed agreement, every overlooked note that could illuminate the truth. I didn't rush, I didn't panic. Every detail became part of a mosaic, a quiet strategy built on the very arrogance that had allowed him to believe he was untouchable. Patience, I reminded myself, would make his eventual fall inevitable. During late nights in the office, when the world outside was asleep, I found solace in the precision of my planning. I mapped out potential outcomes, rehearsed conversations in my head, and considered how each client, each colleague, each partner would react if the truth were laid bare. I wasn't thinking about revenge as a spectacle. I was thinking about justice as a quiet, undeniable inevitability. The betrayal had given me a gift, the chance to act with complete clarity while he remained blind to the storm I was orchestrating. I began cultivating subtle alliances without ever revealing my hand. A casual question here, a seemingly innocuous suggestion there, each carefully placed like a chess piece. Michael, in his overconfidence, assumed I was still reeling, still unsure, still dependent on his manipulation. He had no idea I was quietly assembling a network of knowledge, influence, and documentation that would one day speak louder than his lies ever could. The irony wasn't lost on me. His own success had created the tools of his undoing. At home, I kept my life unchanged. I maintained the calm routines I had always valued. Early mornings, disciplined work, measured interactions, but inside, I was sharpening my awareness, training myself to notice the small tells, the slight exaggerations, the cracks in his story that he didn't even realize he was leaving behind. Every small detail became a weapon. Every lapse in caution on his part became an opportunity. I was learning in silence that revenge is not about chaos or noise. It's about precision, patience, and timing. By the end of that month, I could almost see the pieces falling into place. I understood Michael better than he understood himself, and I understood the system he had tried to manipulate even better than he did. I wasn't ready to strike yet, not because I hesitated, but because a victory executed prematurely is a victory half won. In quiet, in patience, in careful planning, I had discovered a profound truth. True power doesn't announce itself, it waits. And when it moves with inevitability. The first cracks appeared quietly, almost imperceptibly, and yet I recognized them immediately. Michael's overconfidence had blinded him to the subtle signs that the people around him were beginning to notice. Clients who once accepted his word without question started seeking confirmations, double-checking details and occasionally asking for documentation that he hadn't prepared. Each hesitation, each subtle question was a small victory, invisible to the untrained eye, but thunderous to someone who had watched and waited. I didn't confront him directly. I didn't need to. Instead, I allowed the systems I had quietly established to do the work. Carefully forwarded emails, subtle reminders to key contacts, and strategically timed follow-ups began to reveal inconsistencies in his story. Michael began to lose control without realizing why. His decisions grew rushed, his charm more forced, his interactions tinged with defensiveness. I observed every misstep, cataloging each one with patience and precision. There was no gloating, no satisfaction in the moment, only the calm acknowledgement that the seeds I had planted were taking root. I allowed him to feel the illusion of power, while quietly, methodically dismantling the foundation on which he had built it. The subtle leverage I had cultivated began to reach its tipping point. A client who had been promised an important deliverable discovered discrepancies in Michael's reports. A minor partner in our network asked for clarification that Michael could not adequately provide. Each small challenge was magnified by the very arrogance that had led him to believe I was irrelevant. I didn't need to push, the momentum of truth was enough. The more he tried to maintain control, the more he revealed his weakness. Even in the face of what might have seemed ordinary setbacks, I remained calm, deliberate, and invisible. I continued to play my part as if nothing had changed, smiling in meetings, providing subtle suggestions, and maintaining the appearance of stability. This invisible control was intoxicating in its own way, the knowledge that while he fumbled, I was quietly orchestrating the unraveling, completely unhindered by emotion or impatience. He was crumbling under the weight of his own miscalculations, and I was the silent witness of his decline. By the end of that quarter, the shift was undeniable. Michael's authority had weakened, his confidence chipped away by the very system he had once thought he controlled. And yet he remained unaware of the meticulous architecture of his downfall. I had no need for confrontation, for drama, for public humiliation. His collapse was inevitable, quiet and precise, a reflection of the strategy I had cultivated in silence. And as I watched him falter, I realized that the most satisfying victories are never loud. They are patient, calculated, and unshakably certain. It didn't happen all at once. Michael's downfall unfolded like a slow, inevitable tide, eroding the foundations he had taken for granted. Each misstep, Each overlooked detail, each small client complaint became a ripple that spread far beyond his control, and I remained calm, watching with a quiet sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with malice. Justice, I realized, often comes most powerfully when it doesn't announce itself, when it moves with the silent precision of inevitability. Colleagues began to notice the inconsistencies, the cracks in the image he had meticulously curated. Some whispered questions, others requested clarifications that he could not adequately provide. Every time he tried to assert dominance, he was met with polite skepticism or careful hesitation. He believed he was navigating a storm of his own making, unaware that the real storm had been orchestrated long before he even sensed the wind shift. Silence, patience, and preparation had done more than any confrontation ever could. I never needed to speak a word of accusation. I didn't need to call him out or reveal my strategy prematurely. The evidence, subtle but undeniable, was everywhere. Reports, emails, client confirmations, and missed opportunities created a lattice of truth that supported itself. His credibility began to erode naturally, organically, and in ways that no one could dispute. And as the pieces fell into place, I remained outwardly composed, professional, and untouchable. There was no rush, no spectacle, only quiet inevitability. One morning, I watched as a senior client, someone who had once valued Michael above all else, asked him pointed questions that he couldn't answer. I didn't intervene. I simply observed, noting the confusion in his eyes, the slight tremor in his voice, and the small, hesitant steps backward he took in his own confidence. The collapse was not dramatic, but it was absolute. Every carefully constructed lie, every subtle misdirection, every hidden maneuver he had relied upon crumbled silently around him. I felt no triumph in the sense of gloating. That would have cheapened the lesson. Instead, there was a serene clarity, a sense of balance restored, not through chaos but through strategy and control. Betrayal, I had learned, carries its own weight, and those who wield it carelessly often find it slowly turning against them. Watching him flounder, I realized that real power lies not in retaliation, but in orchestrating circumstances so that the truth manifests with unassailable certainty. By the time the dust settled, Michael was reduced to a shadow of the man who had once seemed untouchable. His arrogance had been met with patience, his deception with precision, and his manipulation with observation, and I, quiet and composed, retained not only my integrity, but a renewed understanding of my own strength. Justice had not required confrontation, rage, or spectacle, only careful thought, steadfast patience, and unwavering self-respect. And in that quiet, invisible victory, I discovered a deeper sense of freedom than I had ever known. I realized that revenge had never been the goal. It had been clarity, restoration, and the quiet reclamation of my own power. I had allowed patience to guide me, observation to sharpen my strategy, and silence to maintain my dignity. In the end, Michael's downfall was not only his own undoing, but a mirror reflecting the strength I had cultivated in the shadows. I didn't need applause or acknowledgement. The peace of knowing I had acted wisely and deliberately was more than enough. The office environment shifted naturally after his collapse. Clients returned their trust to those who had quietly upheld their promises. Colleagues who had been unsure of loyalty now approached with renewed confidence, recognizing the subtle but undeniable authority I carried. I didn't seek recognition. I merely continued to act with integrity, and in doing so restored not only my professional standing but my inner calm. Silence, I had learned, speaks louder than confrontation ever could. At home, I allowed myself to breathe fully for the first time in months. The tension that had lodged itself deep in my chest melted away, replaced by a serene awareness that life could be both unpredictable and manageable. Betrayal no longer haunted me as a wound. It existed as a lesson etched into the core of my being. I had survived the quiet storm, orchestrated it with care, and emerged stronger and wiser than before. The weight of resentment no longer held me down. I was free. I began to invest in my personal growth, in projects that had once been paused or neglected. I traveled quietly, read deeply, and cultivated relationships that mattered. Each choice was deliberate, measured, and guided by the understanding that control comes from within, not from forcing outcomes. The world no longer seemed like a battlefield. It was a canvas, and I had learned to move through it with patience, observation, and confidence. Looking back, I understand now that betrayal is never the end. It is a crucible, testing the depth of patience, strategy, and self-respect. Michael's downfall was complete, quiet, and earned by his own miscalculations. I, on the other hand, walked away with something far more valuable than vengeance: peace, growth, and an unshakable sense of personal sovereignty. And in that quiet victory, I discovered freedom in its truest, most profound form. After the storm had passed, I found myself staring at the remnants of the world I had carefully preserved while Michael crumbled. It was quiet now, almost unnervingly so, but in that stillness I began to see opportunity. I had learned to trust my instincts, to read between the lines, and to plan with patience. And now, with no one dictating my path, I could rebuild on my own terms. Every decision became deliberate, measured, and deeply considered, no longer reactive, only proactive. I returned to projects that had once been sidelined in favor of shared responsibility. There was a thrill in reclaiming control, not as an act of competition, but as an assertion of purpose. I approached every client, every colleague, every challenge with a quiet confidence rooted in experience and strategy. The lessons from Michael's betrayal were no longer fresh wounds, but guides. Never assume loyalty, always verify, and let patience do the work that anger cannot. At first, I moved slowly, cautious of overextension or appearing overzealous. Each new success was small, almost imperceptible to the outside observer, but each built on the foundation of knowledge I had painstakingly gathered. The thrill wasn't in the recognition, but in the mastery, knowing I could shape outcomes without force, simply through observation, calculation, and subtle influence. It was a power far greater than any overt dominance. I also began noticing colleagues who had been overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated. Where Michael had exploited relationships for his gain, I started cultivating genuine partnerships, built on trust, clarity, and mutual respect. These alliances weren't flashy, and they weren't designed to impress. They were built to last, quietly strengthening the structure I was now rebuilding. Loyalty, when nurtured correctly, becomes a force as reliable as any strategy. At night, I often reflected on the changes within me. I had learned that patience is not passive, that silence can wield more authority than confrontation, and that self-respect is the ultimate form of security. The betrayal that had once felt like a fracture in my life had now become the crucible that refined me, teaching lessons in awareness, endurance, and strategic restraint. I realized the world had become both more dangerous and more navigable at the same time, and slowly, imperceptibly, I began to feel a sense of joy I hadn't known during the years of quiet preparation. It was not the loud satisfaction of revenge fulfilled, but the deep, enduring comfort of knowing that I could survive betrayal, orchestrate outcomes without spectacle, and rebuild stronger than ever. My life, once threatened by another's ambition, was now a testament to strategy, patience, and the quiet mastery of circumstance. The rebuilding had begun, and with it came a subtle, unshakable freedom. The rebuilding I had started quietly began to ripple outward in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Small successes accumulated unnoticed by most, yet each one strengthened my position and influence. Clients who had been hesitant now sought my counsel directly. Colleagues who had once doubted me began to align with my vision, not out of fear or obligation, but because they recognized the clarity and precision behind every decision I made. My reputation grew, silently, like roots strengthening beneath the surface. I discovered that the most profound victories often come without fanfare. A minor project, completed flawlessly, could shift perceptions more than an ostentatious display. I found myself anticipating problems before they arose, quietly steering outcomes without anyone realizing the orchestration behind them. The lessons from betrayal had transformed into skills of discernment, patience, and influence. I was no longer reactive. I was strategic, moving multiple steps ahead, while others merely responded to circumstance. Unexpectedly, my quiet resurgence attracted attention from mentors and leaders I had never considered approaching. They noticed the consistency, the subtlety, and the thoughtfulness in my work. Invitations to collaborate, to advise, and to guide were extended, not because I had fought or argued, but because my results spoke volumes. The power of silent competence, I realized, eclipsed the temporary thrills of drama or confrontation. Influence, when nurtured thoughtfully, attracts allies effortlessly. Yet I remained cautious. The memory of betrayal lingered as a quiet reminder that trust must always be measured. I continued to observe closely, never assuming loyalty blindly, and testing subtle dynamics before committing. Each interaction, each agreement, each conversation was both an opportunity and a test. I learned to trust patterns and principles rather than personalities, understanding that the strength of my position came as much from careful observation as from decisive action. Over time, I began mentoring others quietly, sharing lessons I had learned without revealing the full weight of my experiences. I guided colleagues through challenges, demonstrating how patience, strategy, and self-control can create victories that last longer than any moment of vengeance. Watching others succeed under guidance became an unexpected source of fulfillment, a reflection of the inner strength I had cultivated in silence and solitude. The ripple effects of subtle, thoughtful action were beginning to manifest in ways far greater than I had initially imagined. By the end of that year, the quiet victories had amassed into a foundation stronger than I had ever known. The world that had once seemed precarious and unpredictable now felt navigable, responsive, and even generous when approached with care. I had learned to wield influence without aggression, to achieve outcomes without spectacle, and to maintain control without drawing attention. And in this ongoing quiet mastery, I discovered that true power is less about domination and more about the ability to shape your life, your environment, and your legacy, all while remaining composed, thoughtful, and unshakably calm. Just when I felt the rhythm of my life returning to equilibrium, a new challenge emerged, one subtle enough to appear ordinary, but complex enough to demand careful attention. A rising competitor within the company, someone ambitious yet inexperienced, began making bold moves, questioning decisions and attempting to disrupt the carefully balanced alliances I had built. The threat was real, but it was silent, understated, and easily underestimated by those around him. I recognized it immediately. This was a test, not of my skill, but of my restraint. I observed him closely, cataloging his ambitions, his mistakes, and the ways he attempted to manipulate perception. Each interaction, every email, every casual comment revealed both his strengths and weaknesses. Rather than confronting him directly, I let him maneuver, gathering intelligence, noting where his overconfidence would betray him. The subtle art of patience, honed during Michael's betrayal, became my greatest ally. I didn't need to act hastily. I only needed to understand and prepare. While he sought recognition through assertiveness, I countered with subtle influence. I adjusted projects, guided conversations, and provided gentle strategic guidance that appeared innocuous, but subtly corrected missteps before they could become visible to leadership. Each correction reinforced my credibility and influence without appearing as intervention. In the shadows, I maintained control while he labored under the illusion of independence. Silence and patience became my instruments, precision my method, and observation my power. I noticed him begin to falter under the pressure he didn't even realize I had applied. Small errors grew in impact, timing slipped, and the confidence that had fueled his audacity began to waver. Colleagues who had once been impressionable noticed the subtle inconsistencies, and naturally, they turned toward the quieter, steadier guidance I provided. It was not a battle of confrontation, it was a quiet orchestration of outcomes, where the truth revealed itself without drama. By carefully allowing events to unfold, while guiding the environment invisibly, I created circumstances where he would either learn humility or self-sabotage. I chose not to intervene overtly, because the satisfaction lies not in forcing the outcome, but in seeing it arrive naturally, shaped by careful observation and strategic restraint. The principles I had mastered during the earlier betrayal now proved applicable on a larger, more complex scale. Patience, knowledge, and silence were my allies in ways more profound than I had imagined. At the end of the quarter, it became clear that his ambition had outpaced his skill. Opportunities slipped, credibility wavered, and those who had once aligned with his boldness returned to the steadiness I embodied. I did nothing publicly, no speeches, no confrontations, yet the influence I had nurtured quietly had shifted the balance completely. Once again, control was restored, and the lesson was clear. Mastery isn't proven through spectacle or force. It is proven through the quiet, strategic shaping of reality itself. With the latest challenge quietly neutralized, I turned my attention to consolidation. It wasn't enough to survive betrayal or to outmaneuver a rival. True mastery required embedding stability into every aspect of my professional and personal life. I began organizing teams around shared principles rather than personalities, creating structures that rewarded competence, reliability, and subtle initiative. In doing so, I transformed the environment from one susceptible to manipulation into one guided by clarity, integrity, and quiet accountability. I realized that influence, when exercised subtly, multiplies over time. Every colleague I guided, every partnership I nurtured, and every client interaction strengthened the latticework of trust and credibility I had been constructing for years. Unlike overt displays of power, these victories were invisible to outsiders, but palpable to those who relied on consistent, reliable leadership. Quiet competence became my signature, patience my trademark. Others' assumed authority came naturally to me, unaware of the deliberate cultivation behind every action. I also began mentoring, promising talent, sharing lessons I had learned through both betrayal and patience. Not every lesson was easy, nor every truth comfortable, but guiding others in subtle, strategic ways became a source of fulfillment I hadn't anticipated. I saw glimpses of myself in their decisions, small moments where careful observation, patience, and clarity yielded results far beyond immediate recognition. In teaching, I reinforced my own mastery, while nurturing a culture that would outlast any single individual. At home, I cultivated the inner life that mirrored my professional growth. Quiet mornings, focused reading, measured reflection, each practice reinforced my mental clarity and emotional resilience. I understood that the ability to influence externally depended on mastery internally. Betrayal, rivalry, and subtle power plays could all be navigated with composure if the mind was disciplined and the heart free of reactive impulses, freedom, I realized, was cultivated from within, not granted by circumstance. By this stage, I was no longer defined by past betrayals or the quiet collapses I had orchestrated. I had grown beyond them, seeing each as a stepping stone rather than a trap. Success, influence, and respect had become byproducts of deliberate action, not outcomes of vengeance or manipulation. The lessons were clear. Patience shapes reality, silence amplifies authority, and control is earned through strategy rather than spectacle. I had become a master not only of circumstance, but of myself. And yet, even in this consolidation, I remained vigilant. Life is unpredictable, and power unguarded invites challenge. But I no longer feared betrayal or misstep. I had internalized the principles that ensured resilience, clarity, and quiet dominance. I moved forward with calm assurance, knowing that my influence was secure, my mind unshakable, and my path guided, not by reaction, but by deliberate, intelligent strategy. The foundations were set, and the future awaited, carefully, patiently, and under my quiet control. With professional stability secured, my attention turned inward, toward the deeper layers of life that had often been neglected. Betrayal, quiet victories, and strategic mastery had taught me much about others, but now I sought mastery over myself. I began to explore philosophies, practices, and disciplines that emphasized clarity, patience, and balance, a mental framework that would allow me to navigate not only the external world, but also the subtle currents within my own mind. I studied the nuances of decision-making, human behavior, and long-term planning with renewed intensity. Every lesson from past conflicts became a guide. Observe more than you speak, act more than you announce, and measure the weight of every choice before committing. I discovered that wisdom was cultivated in the quiet spaces between action, in the reflection that comes after observation. The more I practiced this, the more effortless my influence became, no longer dependent on circumstance, but an extension of deliberate thought and calm presence. Relationships that had once been transactional transformed under this approach. I began to nurture meaningful connections, not for leverage or advantage, but for shared growth and understanding. Loyalty became reciprocal, trust carefully measured, and freely given when deserved. The lessons from betrayal had not hardened me. They had refined me, teaching me the subtle balance between discernment and openness, between vigilance and generosity. I also explored new avenues of creativity and personal challenge. Hobbies, travel, and intellectual pursuits that had once been postponed became integral to my life. Each venture was undertaken with the same quiet deliberation I had applied to strategy: observe, learn, and execute thoughtfully. The difference now was joy, a patient, grounded joy rooted in the freedom of choice, the clarity of mind, and the absence of fear that had once dominated my thinking. Mentorship continued to grow in importance. I found profound satisfaction in guiding others, not just through professional obstacles, but through the lessons of patience, restraint, and self-mastery. Watching others succeed under the principles I had refined brought a quiet, enduring sense of fulfillment. The victories that once relied on dismantling others' illusions had been replaced by victories in fostering growth, understanding, and subtle empowerment. By the end of this period, I felt a deep, unshakable peace. Life was no longer a series of battles or strategic maneuvers. It was a deliberate, thoughtful journey. The lessons of betrayal, revenge, and careful orchestration had matured into wisdom. I had learned that true freedom, true influence, and true mastery arise not from dominance over others, but from control over oneself, and from the patient cultivation of a life lived with clarity, dignity, and quiet power. As my life settled into a rhythm of quiet control and thoughtful action, I began to consider legacy, not the kind measured in accolades or public recognition, but the kind that quietly shapes the lives of others long after the moment has passed. I started documenting lessons learned, strategies, observations, and principles, not for display, but as a framework for others navigating complex challenges. Colleagues and protégés approached me with questions, seeking guidance on patience, decision-making, and maintaining composure under pressure. I found satisfaction in providing subtle mentorship, planting seeds of resilience and strategy that would grow independently, shaped by the choices and insights of those I guided. The work was invisible to most, yet immeasurably impactful. In parallel, I cultivated a disciplined personal life that mirrored the structure I had established professionally. Mornings became moments of reflection, evenings times for reading, writing, and silent contemplation. Each practice reinforced my internal clarity and strengthened my resilience. I recognized that true legacy is grounded not only in external achievements, but in the cultivation of a self that can endure challenges, inspire growth, and remain composed regardless of circumstance. Opportunities to influence larger systems emerged naturally. Invitations to collaborate, consult, or advise arose without effort, because reputation, built quietly through consistent integrity and competence, attracts engagement organically. I realized that the battles of the past, betrayal, rivalry, and strategic orchestration, had prepared me not for confrontation, but for leadership that emanates calm authority. Influence, exercised wisely, is less about controlling outcomes and more about shaping the environment in ways that endure. I also noticed the subtle transformations in others. Formerly overlooked colleagues began demonstrating confidence and skill I had nurtured indirectly. Small victories multiplied quietly across teams and projects, echoing the patient, deliberate approach I had learned from experience. The joy of seeing growth unfold without interference or spectacle surpassed the satisfaction of any direct triumph over an adversary. I had discovered a more profound form of power, one that elevates rather than dominates. By the end of this period, I felt a deep contentment, a sense that life's earlier turbulence had forged not only strength and skill, but wisdom and perspective. I had navigated betrayal, orchestrated outcomes with precision, and rebuilt my life with patience and integrity. Now, the focus shifted toward enduring impact, a legacy of calm authority and mentorship that could guide others toward self-mastery. The storm had passed, leaving in its wake not chaos, but the quiet architecture of a life fully understood, fully controlled, and fully lived. Life had shifted into a rhythm of quiet purpose. The battles I had once waged, the betrayals, the subtle orchestration of outcomes, the patient dismantling of arrogance, now felt like distant lessons, guiding principles rather than daily challenges. I noticed opportunities appearing almost effortlessly, not because I sought them, but because a reputation built on consistency, clarity, and quiet competence naturally drew them toward me. Influence, I realized, grows silently, like roots spreading beneath the surface, shaping outcomes without fanfare. I began to see the broader impact of my actions. Colleagues I had mentored began to rise, carrying forward principles of patience, observation, and strategic restraint. Projects I had subtly guided flourished, producing results that reflected a harmony between diligence and insight. The satisfaction was subtle, yet profound. The joy was not in recognition or accolades, but in knowing that careful, deliberate action had created ripples far beyond my immediate perception. The foundation I had laid years ago continued to support growth, quietly and reliably. Unexpected opportunities emerged, collaborations with leaders I respected, invitations to share insights, and projects that allowed me to shape influence on a larger scale. These were not opportunities I had to chase. They arrived naturally, attracted by a pattern of competence, integrity, and calm authority. I realized that real power manifests not through force or spectacle, but through the credibility and trust built by consistent, deliberate action over time. Silence, patience, and strategic insight had become my most powerful tools. Even in moments of personal reflection, I found clarity and fulfillment. The lessons from betrayal, once painful and disorienting, had become invaluable guides. I understood the subtle balance between vigilance and openness, control and flexibility, observation and intervention. Life no longer felt like a series of unpredictable challenges. It became a landscape I could navigate with deliberate precision, guided by wisdom, self-respect, and inner composure. I also took time to invest in relationships and experiences that had once been neglected. Travel, intellectual exploration, and meaningful connections became extensions of the principles I had honed. Deliberate engagement, thoughtful observation, and patient nurturing of growth. Every interaction and every choice was guided by clarity, creating a life both rich in experience and firmly grounded in personal mastery. The world, once fraught with uncertainty, now responded to the quiet authority I had cultivated. By the end of this chapter of life, I felt a deep, unshakable peace. Betrayal, conflict, and strategic orchestration had forged not only resilience, but wisdom, perspective, and influence. The quiet victories of the past had matured into enduring impact, mentorship, and personal fulfillment. And in that stillness, I realized that life's greatest triumphs are often invisible, not announced with fanfare, but quietly woven into the fabric of reality, leaving a legacy of calm mastery and enduring freedom.